Hi pagans, hi witches, hi friends and allies and supporters of pagans and witches. Hello to anybody who might be curious or just wants to learn about beliefs and spiritual pathways that are different from whatever spiritual pathway you're on. Rambling Witch episode 2 is now in session and I'm going to be talking about tools today. I thought this would be kind of a nice next step, tools and the whole issue surrounding witches using tools and witches' attitude towards the tools that they use in their craft is a discussion that comes up regularly on forums, in blogs, and kind of sweeps across YouTube like wildfire every few months or so. I've certainly seen a couple of spates of back and forth debates about the value of tools and about how we kind of view tools and so on. So I wanted to discuss that in this episode. I will warn you in advance that I did drink quite a lot of alcohol last night. Those of you who follow me on Instagram will know that I was on the cocktails last night. It was my best friend's birthday, so I'm feeling a little bit worse for wear. But I've had some birthday cake. I'm on the honey jasmine incense and I've got a large cup of coffee. So that's going to keep me going while I do my rambling. Also, please be aware that the Rambling Witch series is specifically intended to riff on my personal opinions and perspectives. These videos are not intended to be necessarily instructional in any way. They're just intended for me to kind of give my thoughts and opinions and talk about some of the things that I've kind of perceived and the way that I have kind of seen things. So, you know, it's not something that's intended to be overtly instructional. I'm not trying to teach anyone anything. I'm just basically going to riff on my personal opinions as a practicing witch. You can choose to see the tools of the witch as purely the tools that are placed on the altar and used in spellcraft and ritual, or as anything physical or tangible that a witch uses to enhance their craft. For me, I just see anything that I utilise to hone my craft, to enhance my craft, or to make anything happen with regards to spellcraft or ritual or anything of that nature to be tools. So I consider my prayer beads to be a tool. I consider my Book of Shadows and my Book of Mirrors to be tools. I consider any books that I'm using to advance my mind in a magical way, in a spiritual way, anything like that I consider to be tools. The incense I burn is a tool. The crystals that I have are tools. The tarot cards that I have are tools. There are classic tools that, you know, many witches have. Some of them are very kind of intrinsic within Wiccan belief. For example, the chalice, the athame or the blade, the wand, you know, the pentacle, those things. Then you've got things like the besom, you know, the witch's broom, the cauldron. You've got things that are kind of known to be witches' tools outside of the realm of witchcraft and paganism. You know, there are certain tools that people, you know, would associate with witches. But then there's all this other stuff that, whether you're a Wiccan or not, you know, that there's certain things that you use that are sacred to you. Lots of witches have certain specific pieces of jewellery that they either wear all the time or during spellcraft and ritual. Lots of witches have clothing that they only wear, you know, for the purpose of spellcraft or ritual, or for the celebrating the sabbats or esbats, that kind of thing. You could even say that the food that you eat after you've done ritual, you know, in Wiccan belief they call it the cakes and ale, you know, that you consume to ground you after being in the ritual space and occupying the ritual mindset is a tool. You know, you could consider anything tangible to be your tool. And in fact, the age-old thing that a lot of witches come back to, that a lot of older and more advanced witches try to encourage newer witches to take on and understand, is that the most intrinsic and the most important, the most essential, the non-negotiable tool for the witch is the mind, and everything else is just painted bread, as Frida Kahlo would have put it. You know, everything else is just by the by. Everything else is nice, it's pretty, it's trinkets, you know, it makes the experience more interesting maybe, or more exciting maybe, but your mind is the most important tool, and never to forget that. And I can get on board with that entirely, of course. But I also don't subscribe to this idea that tools are nothing, that tools are completely unimportant, that tools should not mean anything to us. And in fact, I'm going to link you guys to a video that Thorn from Drawing Canars made about materialism and the idea of materiality and objects in the craft, and the various different opinions that go around regarding, you know, the fact that tangible items that you use within the craft shouldn't be important, and that kind of holding them with any degree of significance or importance in your mind is a mistake. having lots of tools that you use in your craft does not make you intrinsically into a witch, nor does it make you a better or more superior or more advanced witch than a witch who doesn't use tools. Being a witch that doesn't use any tools, a witch that totally just uses the power of the mind with no kind of external markers or signifiers or tangible objects, does not make you a better or more superior or more advanced witch than a witch that has loads of tools, and a witch that kind of spends money on fancy tools even. It's just different roads for different people. It's horses for courses, you know, it's strokes for folks. And I really believe that it's important to understand that there's no one size fits all answer to the question, what is the nature of, you know, physical objects in the craft? What is the value of a physical object as a tool in a witch's craft, you know? There really is no one size fits all answer to that question. And when we try and push everybody into this same box, where we kind of try and enforce this idea that tools are worthless, tools don't really mean anything, you know, it's only the mind that gives power to the tool, I think that we are missing out on something really important, which is one of the oldest theological beliefs on planet Earth, and that is the idea that objects are invested themselves with selfhood, with life, you know, with soul, you know, animism, the idea that objects themselves have a life, objects themselves hold an energy which is quite apart from anything that we might invest into it with our own consciousness. And there are many witches who hold animistic beliefs, you know, and there are many shamans who hold animistic beliefs. And in Thorne's video, she goes into this idea that a lot of scholars who study various different traditions and stuff like that, it's been a while since I've seen the video, but this is the gist of it, that scholars actually make the mistake of looking at objects in a different way to the way that the people that use them would have looked at them. The people that use them wouldn't have looked at them through this specific lens of seeing them purely as objects. They would have seen them as invested with their own life force, with their own soul, with their own power, their own energy, you know? And I think it's really important to understand that certain witches will feel that way, and that there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That is a very widespread and widely held belief. There's also a belief, of course, that you can invest objects with a specific energy or life force, but then the life force is taken on, or the energy is taken on by that specific object, and it then has what we could potentially call a life of its own, I guess, in a way. I guess I don't have the vernacular to discuss this and explain it in a really kind of academic and scholarly way, but I guess you guys know what I mean. There is kind of this widely held attitude that tools are just inanimate objects and that it's only the witch that gives the tools power. But I just think it's really important going into this discussion, and it's really important to keep on your mind the fact that not all witches are going to feel that way, and that that's okay. And it's really important not to club everybody into that specific box where it's really about things being dead until the witch invests them with life or importance or meaning, because not everybody feels that way. And certainly there are a great many witches who don't feel that way about things like sacred geology, sacred geometry, you know, the crystals that we use, for example. Many witches don't feel that that stuff is lifeless until we give it life. Actually, a great many witches feel that stones hold specific and sacred vibrations that can be tapped into and harnessed and used. So I guess that would be one way in which the animistic side of things would come into play in a way that perhaps more witches could understand and be familiar with. In fact, you know, I don't think it's that rare altogether for witches to see objects as having a specific energy that needs to be tapped into and understood and kind of worked with, rather than investing an inanimate object with an energy signature. For example, a lot of witches have spoken to me through the years about the energy of a tarot deck and talking about what the tarot deck wants the witch to do with it, or what the tarot deck is saying that it's intended to be used for. So in those situations, again, a witch is actually listening to an object rather than stamping his or her energy signature or his or her intention onto an object. The witch is listening in. The witch already feels that the object has a purpose. The object has something to say itself. And for some people this might be very fucking Fantasia, you know, like when Mickey Mouse is the wizard's apprentice and all the brooms come to life and stuff like that. But actually for a lot of people this is just second nature. It's totally normal. And I think it's really important to respect and understand that going into any discussion about tools, and the way that certain people just so confidently talk about them as inanimate objects, and you know, they don't have any power aside from the power invested into them by the witch, and they really mean nothing. It's the mind of the witch that does everything. I just think it's really important to understand that for some witches this is not the case. I've moved to get out of the bloody stream of sunlight. Since I've been doing the rounds on pagan forums and being on YouTube and being involved with the YouTube community, I have witnessed some kind of opinions and attitudes that at first actually shocked me, and over time I've just become completely desensitised to them and totally used to them. But at first they shocked me and they saddened me. And then after a while I was like, okay, look, this is par for the course. Obviously loads of witches feel this way. And it's an attitude which, you know, it just contains a certain amount of elitism and judgment regarding those witches who do seem to favour tools and who do seem to invest more money into tools and seem to invest more importance into tools and the value of having tools for their craft. There's quite a lot of kickback and resistance against this attitude of placing importance onto tools. And it seems to be tied in with anti-materialism, which is a big thing. At this point in history and at this point in time, I think it's actually got a lot of focus placed on it, you know, that importance of not being materialistic and only having what we need, not necessarily purchasing everything that we want, and, you know, the damage that kind of consumerism is doing to the world and to our sense of who we are as people, to the planet, you know, that kind of thing, and potentially to other people, you know, globalisation, the carbon footprint and all that kind of stuff. And, you know, but because of these attitudes, I think that there has been some kind of a kickback, a resistance, when people look at witches who are practising with a lot of tools, who seem to invest a lot of importance into their tools and that kind of thing. Although I think it's very important that witches who are new on the path understand that they don't need tools to be a good practitioner, that they don't need to have all of their tools before they can consider themselves to be a witch, that tangible objects are not the marker of whether or not you are a witch. I think it's very important to let witches that are new to the path know these things. I also think it's very important to understand that if you come across a witch who has a great deal of tools and clearly spends a lot of money on tools, or clearly spends a lot of time collecting tools or making tools, or places a lot of emphasis on tools, when you come across a witch like that, it doesn't mean that that witch thinks that the tools are what's important. It doesn't mean that that witch has given him or herself over to this idea that without the tools they're nothing, and without the tools they can't practice the craft, and without the tools, you know, everything else is meaningless. And I think when you look at somebody who obviously places an emphasis on tangible objects, it's really important that you don't equate that with some kind of belief on their end that they need the tangible objects, because that's quite often not the case. Why do we use objects in the craft? One reason I would say that we use objects in the craft is symbolism and metaphor, as above, so below, as within, so without. The notion of ritual being a bridge between the conscious and the unconscious, between one realm and another, between the realm of the living and the realm of the dead, between waking and dreaming, all of that kind of thing. I feel like the tangible act, the action, the setup of different objects to mean different things, to symbolise what's going on in that other realm, that's what makes it real in this realm, in a sense. So for me it's kind of quite a Jungian, I guess, ideology. Many witches use objects for things like sympathetic magic. Sympathetic magic is the absolute essence of kind of metaphor, of using something to represent something else, and to invest your energy into an object as though that object is something or someone else, you know. Another reason that we use physical objects quite often is because paganism is not a belief system largely that denigrates or undervalues or downplays the physical realm. You know, it's very often called an earth-based path. It's very often a path for people that have both feet in the world. It's a path for people that see God in nature and kind of learn from the natural turning of the cycles and all of that kind of stuff. And so really we don't denigrate or downplay the value of the physical. We're not into seeing sex as ungodly. We're not into seeing eating and drinking or dancing as ungodly. You know, we are of the body, we are of the flesh, and paganism is vastly kind of at one with that notion, you know. If you look at a lot of Eastern ideas and Eastern traditions, there is this kind of split between spirit and matter. And matter is often seen to be something that can be fixated upon and can drag one away from the spiritual world, from the spiritual experience, from the spiritual intention. I'm not going to go into various different belief systems and what they teach with regard to materialism and what they teach with regard to the physical, but I would suggest looking into it if you don't have an awareness of those things, because it's very obvious and very clear that many Eastern traditions see the physical as somehow a distraction or somehow as an opposite to the spiritual and to the spiritual path. With the mixing of East and West, and with kind of the diluting and the merging of various different traditions, we've seen a lot of attitudes in witchcraft and paganism that are to do with rejecting the material, that are to do with moving somehow beyond materiality and the realm of the physical. And actually, I see this as a contradiction. I don't see these ideas as things that sit together. I very much value a lot of Eastern ideas, and of course I adopt many of those things into my practice, and I love learning about them. But I actually think that there's this weird place in witchcraft and paganism now that exists inside the overall mentality, the mindscape, if you will, of what it is that we're doing as practitioners. And that place is a weird little part on the terrain for me, because it's basically this part where pagans and witches are saying, you know, the material is bad, the material is other to what is spiritual. If you place too much emphasis on the material, then you can't also be spiritual. It has to be one or the other. You must reject and give up any meaning that you place onto anything physical, any meaning that you place onto anything tangible. And we need to elevate ourselves. We need to transcend above the physical and have this higher experience. Now, for me, that's not pagan. And I kind of just don't really understand it. And it's not really about being rigid and stringent about what paganism is or isn't. I just genuinely see one of the essences, one of the central cores of pagan belief as being other to downplaying or denigrating or undervaluing the physical. And that's part of the reason that I was so drawn to paganism, you know? I was so drawn to how visceral it is, to how tangible, how touchable, how real, how textured it is, how it teaches me to be in my body, and how it teaches me to be barefoot on the grass and in the world, and to feel each of the seasons, to feel it on my skin, and to understand how it represents me and the changes that are going on within me. And those things were interesting to me, particularly. And, you know, people do talk about these three kind of types of paganism, and I'll link below to a video where, you know, I go into the three types of paganism that have kind of been identified, that kind of create this triad where you can kind of go off into different explorations of what paganism means to different people. And I suppose I am, you know, in the psycho-spiritual part of it more than I am in the kind of deity-focused part of it, or in the earth-based part of it. But I kind of occupy all three of those different spaces. And so I'm coming from an attitude of having both feet in the world. I am coming from an attitude of seeing things as metaphor, like I see the seasons as metaphor for what's going on in my life, for example. But there's never been any point in my journey as a pagan where I've thought to myself, none of this stuff means anything, and when I place value in it, I am undervaluing my experience as a spiritual being. To me, it just doesn't work like that, and I refuse to see this planet as a train station on the way to something greater, or as a lower experience than anything I could experience in the spiritual. I just don't understand that. I don't really think that there is a difference, ultimately. I don't think that hollow materialism, which comes from a place of need, is a healthy thing. But I really don't think it's healthy for somebody to look at a practitioner who places emphasis on tools or has a certain amount of tools and judge them as being like materialistic in an empty way, and judge them as being hollow spiritually because of that. I think that that is the definition of an attitude that one gets themselves into where their own practice is lacking in some way, or where they feel lacking in some way, and so they look at somebody else's path and instantly judge it as being empty or being meaningless. I think it's really important to understand that for a lot of pagans, you know, for a lot of pagan witches, there's nothing unholy or unspiritual or tacky or wrong or inferior about the physical and about those things that we can use in the physical that are representative of our path, of our magic, of what we're trying to do in ritual, or any of those things. And so I just think it's really important that when you are looking at somebody and viewing their path through your specific lens and deciding that it's materialistic, that it's fickle, that it's frivolous because it involves stuff, I think it's really important to rein that back in and look at why you're having that response. And the reason that you're having that response is always personal. It's not to do with the other person, it's to do with you as a person. And I just think it's really important to take things back to self, because one has no right to judge another's path as materialistic. Just like I was talking about in my video about collecting tarot and oracle cards, it might look like empty materialism from an outside perspective, from somebody who lives from another point of view and doesn't grasp or understand the desire to collect these things, and doesn't grasp or understand the mentality of people who consistently collect deck after deck after deck. From an outside perspective, somebody would just look at that and go, okay, look, you're done. Move the fuck on. You've got enough decks. And it must seem kind of frustrating, but you've got to bring that back to self, you know, because from the collector's point of view, it's not empty materialism. It is a sincere passion, born of something very important, born of a love of symbolism and a deep love of what the tool of tarot means and can do. So from that inside perspective, it's not to do with materialism at all. It's to do with something far more vital and far more alive. And from that outside perspective, it's really important, if you notice yourself judging, to rein that shit back in and just bring it back to a place of self-inquiry. My personal journey with altars and tools has been really interesting. I had a Catholic family on my father's side. I wasn't raised as a Catholic, but I was raised around mass, you know, and you know, I had a Catholic nana and I went to mass with her, and she had statuettes of Mary in the house and statuettes of saints and pictures of icons and stuff like that. So, you know, she had rosaries. I was very exposed to these things when I was younger, and I was inspired by them, and it stuck with me and it influenced me massively. There's absolutely no doubt about it. I was very familiar from a very young age with the notion of objects that were kind of tied intrinsically to the religion of the household, to the meaning of the religion of the household, and to devotion. You know, many objects in my nana's house and in my Auntie Mary's house were dotted around to remind them of their spiritual beliefs and keep them in touch with their spiritual beliefs throughout the day. And then of course they'd go to church, you know, and there would be statues and there would be like stained glass windows. And so I was very exposed very early to the idea of things like lighting candles, lighting incense, you know, genuflecting in front of statuettes and stuff like that. And it stuck with me and it stayed with me, and I really think it had such a profound effect on me that for my personal psychology, it wound around my mind like ivy around a house, and it's just stuck there and it stayed there. And to me, there's just something so beautiful about statuettes and about altars and shrines and spaces of devotion and reflection within a household or within a public situation. And I just love that stuff, and I can't get enough of it. You know, I'll like find myself sometimes scrolling something like fuck yeah pagan altars or witches altars on Tumblr, or just having a look at altars across different belief systems and having a look at altars and shrines that are set up for public holidays in different parts of the world. And that to me is inspiring and beautiful. I'm really interested in psychology, in stuff like sand play. Look it up to get more familiar with it. But it's really to do with using objects to create a map of something that's going on within your psyche, within the landscape of your mind, and using the objects to offer metaphors and to offer symbolic dynamics that show somebody, a therapist, how you feel about a situation or relationship in your mind. For me, sand play is really what I'm doing quite often with my altar space. You know, I'm creating something that is a reflection of my intentions and a reflection of what I'm going through in my experience as a witch and as a woman. So, you know, I'm really interested in things like that in psychology as well. I'm interested in anything to do with how we can use objects to express something which is interior and which is deep in the interior. And I just find that so fascinating and endlessly fascinating. So for me, of course, I was always going to be a witch who was relatively interested in tools and interested in having an altar, although I didn't have an altar until quite late on. When I was living at home with my mother, I would have reflection spaces, but I would not have a working altar. I didn't have a working altar until I left home. I had working altars on and off when I was living with my first boyfriend that I ever lived with, but I would say there was something non-committal about them. There was something still a little bit kind of decorative and not really personal, you know. There was something missing. I'm not really sure how to describe it, but maybe some witches out there will know what I mean, where it was kind of more notional. It was something that was set up to ease me in, but wasn't something that had completely and totally clicked. I would sit in front of it to do my meditations and such, but there was something about it that was kind of display, and that I couldn't really feel clicked into like two pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. And I think that's how a witch should feel about their altar. So creating that first altar and having that and changing that up was a statement, and it was something really important for my personal development. But then I didn't have an altar for a whole bunch of time, and then that became even more of a whole bunch of time. But I never really considered myself less of a witch, you know. I was going on my own little journey, and I was kind of exploring what was ultimately important to me and what was really going to be important in my practice. I also explored whether or not witch was even a suitable moniker for me any longer. And you know, during that time I celebrated some of the Sabbats and I didn't celebrate others, and I kind of went along in my own kind of little way. I reclaimed the word witch about 3.5 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, something like that. I guess I properly reclaimed it like 3.5 years ago. I really just, like, I brought it back. I came back to it. That was when stuff started to get really real, when I knew that I wanted a working altar. I wanted something that clicked into me, something that drew me to it every single morning. And I want to stress that I do not think altars are important for all witches, and I think if you are not called to create an altar, then there is nothing wrong with you. You are not weird, you are not a freak in any way. For a great many witches, it feels incredibly empowering and like reinforcing to have an altar, and it just makes sense and it feels like home. But to a lot of other witches, it just doesn't seem like something that they feel called to do. And for a lot of other witches, it feels like something that they'll feel called to do in the future, but they can't at this moment in time for one reason or another that's to do with their dynamics in their home or their circumstances. Whether or not they can be open about their craft, whether or not they have their own room at the moment, etc., etc., and so on. And that doesn't make you any less of a witch whatsoever. And you can always do stuff like set up temporary altars. I've lived in the house that I live in now for 5 months, and during that time I have not felt called to set up an altar. Before I moved, I had a fully working altar, and it had been set up for, you know, quite a long time, as I've just said. But since I moved into my new place, I have not felt called to set up an altar. There's a space for it in one of the rooms that I kind of have, but I haven't felt called to set it up. Now, when I moved in here, I did cleansings on both of the rooms. But then as soon as we moved in, I just put it off, and my boyfriend said, you know, do you want to set your altar up? Do you want me to go and get the table for you and you can blah, blah, blah? And I would say, no, it's just, no, something about it doesn't feel right. And I would say I don't need it. I have been doing my daily practice since we arrived here on this couch with my prayer beads and my incense, but I haven't had an altar. I haven't been sitting in front of an altar. And for the Sabbats and things like that, I've set up temporary altar spaces on the floor in here. So I actually haven't had a working altar. Do I feel like any less of a witch? No, I didn't feel intuitively called to have one. I do now, actually. Just before the summer solstice, I felt like, yeah, okay, you know, I'm gonna have one for the next Sabbath. I do think it's time now. It's just one of those things where my intuition didn't feel called, and it just didn't feel right, so I didn't do it. So yeah, I'm gonna be creating my new altar space, and I'm really excited about that. And as far as tools go, I take a very non-Wiccan approach. When I was younger and I first started reading about the craft, I would read about Wicca, and I would read about the tools that were suggested for Wicca, and they didn't really make a great deal of sense to me, and what they were supposed to be symbolic of, certainly according to certain books, didn't really make much sense to me. It was all about, like, you know, the knife is the masculine, and you place the knife into the chalice, and it represents the mixing of the masculine with the feminine, and it all seemed kind of, to me, about kind of mechanical stuff, biological stuff, you know, phallic symbols and things like that. And I didn't gel with that when I was younger. I didn't gel with that as a teenager. For me, tools have always had to be things that deeply inspire me and that I have a very personal connection to. And I have used all kinds of things from, you know, I've involved poetry in my practice. So I for a long time kept a book of Dylan Thomas's poems. underneath my altar, and I would use that. I would use Anne Sexton's poetry. I've used children's toys for my tools. I've had certain pieces of jewellery that I've used, found objects that I've used, like stones and feathers and all that kind of thing. Random found objects that I found in the street or found in second-hand shops that had a really good energy to me. I do use oils, I do use crystals, I do use incense and that kind of thing, but I also use magazines. I do a lot of art magic, and I've created my own techniques for doing art magic, and I use collage, and so I use magazines. Magazines to me are a magical tool as well as being an artistic tool and an artistic medium. For me, tools have got to be things that I feel a connection to, that I feel an affection for, that I feel are light-hearted and elevating for me in some way or emotionally, or that I feel kind of this click with, you know. I like to use tools to create an atmosphere, and I think that's what a lot of witches get into when they think about purchasing, you know, a very beautiful wand with the specific crystals in it that's very, you know, beautifully carved, or they want to get a cauldron that is really impressive looking or whatever. I think it's to create that energy, to create that atmosphere. It's to do something in the psyche. You know, when you look at the tools, you feel that there's just something really grand and really sacred about them. And again, I want to stress, I think it's really important and really wonderful that witches are stressing to new witches on the path that these tools are not necessary. You know, like don't feel the pressure. I think there's a lot of pressure. People just feel a lot of pressure to go that way. And they think, do I need to spend a lot of money? Will that legitimise my practice in some way? Is that what I'm supposed to be doing? And my advice would be, if you feel the call to use tools and you feel that that is part of what is going to make it pop for you, don't let anyone tell you that that makes you less of a witch, and don't let anyone tell you that you shouldn't be spending your money on that if that's what you want to spend some of your excess income on. Likewise, if you feel this pressure to follow in the footsteps of witches with this kind of, you know, with grand collections of tools and stuff, but it doesn't really come from a real place and it doesn't really feed your sense of who you are as a practitioner, and you feel like you have to do it but you don't necessarily want to do it, don't do it. Do not do it. And likewise, if you see a fancy cauldron with, like, you know, studded with clear quartz and stuff like that, and it looks really good to you, but it costs like a few $100s and you don't have the money for that kind of thing, don't torture yourself by telling yourself that you need that altar, that cauldron, you know, or that posh wand or whatever you've seen. Don't torture yourself and tell yourself that you need that to be the witch that you were born to be, because that is empty materialism. That is what we should ride against. We should ride against this idea that we need to spend a massive amount of money in order to legitimise us or make our lives good, make our lives more enjoyable, make our lives worth living. That to me is where it gets dangerous, you know, and that I would advise against. Just think about, you know, going for a walk on a summer's day, or closing your eyes and upturning your face to the rain and just feeling the rain. You know, these things cost nothing, and you must know the joy of them. You must know the value of them. You ever gone for a walk in a storm? Come on, that costs nothing, and it is exhilarating. It lives in your blood for weeks afterwards, that feeling. My boyfriend and I went for several walks in the summer storms last year, the electric storms, and it was insane. And that stuff costs nothing. It doesn't cost a penny. So if you find yourself wrapped up in this really tortured idea that you need this thing that costs hundreds of pounds that you've seen, that you're like, oh, that looks so gorgeous and it would make me such a better witch, or everything would be so much better once I've got that, just remember that that is probably more of a God-shaped hole, and once you try and fill it with that expensive crystal studded cauldron, you're going to find that there's some other tool that you need to fill it with as well, and then you're going to find that there's something else that you really need, and then there's going to be this, like, you know, like gorgeous book of shadows that's kind of dipped in gold or some crap, and you need that. You know what I mean? Like, there's always going to be something else. If you're telling yourself that you need to drop major coin to make your practice into everything that it could be and to make you happy, then step back from that immediately, you know. And there are witches on YouTube who will happily tell you that you don't need to spend money on an expensive chalice, you can just use a polystyrene cup or anything like that. And I think that these points are worth making, you know. I don't think it needs to lead down a route of elitism and judgment and excluding witches who are interested in having a gorgeous collection of high quality tools. at all. I don't think it needs to go down that road, but I do think that people who feel insecure or intimidated by other people's collections of tools, or feel like they somehow need to be spending this money that they don't have, or that they feel like they don't really want to spend, those people maybe need a little bit of reassurance. So that isn't what the craft is about, and that doesn't make you legitimate as a witch whatsoever. So I think that's something really important to note before I finish up. Thank you so much for listening to my my rambly, witchy ideas about tools, and I'd love to know your opinions below. And until next time, so much love to you guys, and blessed be.